Hello everyone, Jonathan Alfonso, and welcome to our YouTube channel. On today's video, I want to cover a new ordinance that was passed in Miami-Dade County relating to septic tanks and why I think this ordinance was passed, what the ordinance actually states, and what I think the future looks like after this ordinance. So let's jump right into it. Miami-Dade County passed an ordinance 21-49 that went into effect on July 30th. Now, this ordinance provides must disclose that there is a septic tank on the property prior to entering into contract, and secondly, requiring that the conveyance document, i.e. the deed that is executed at closing by the seller, be acknowledged by the buyer and contain language referencing the fact that there is a septic tank on the property. So in other words, warranty deeds in Miami-Dade County for properties having septic tanks moving forward will have an additional section that will be signed by the buyer where they acknowledge that there is a septic tank on the property and it has been disclosed to them. So the first thing that we need to cover is how exactly did we get here? So about a week and a half ago in our office, I invited our lien search provider to come and speak about this because they had someone who was more familiar with the issue, and they spoke about the ordinance and how it came to be. Now, the interesting thing that they brought up is that in 2012, Miami-Dade County was sued by the federal government and the EPA. And basically, they were suing Miami-Dade County as a result of discharge of sewage into Biscayne Bay. Now, apparently, a lot of this has to do with infrastructure, the sewage systems, etc. And in 2014, Miami-Dade County and the EPA entered into a consent decree whereby Miami-Dade County agreed to spend approximately $1.6 billion over the next 15 years upgrading its sewage treatment systems. Now, apparently a lot of this, stepping back, has to do with also some studies that have been released, one of which was released in 2018, which indicated that in Miami-Dade County, there is approximately 108,000 septic tanks. Of those 108,000 septic tanks, approximately 105,000 are on residential properties. Now, the study in 2018 found that approximately 64% of those septic tanks will be compromised, I believe it was by the year 2040. In other words, they believe that a lot of these septic tanks will not function as they are intended to function as a result of rising sea level waters. So in order to understand this, you have to understand that Miami-Dade County basically rests on a bed of water, and that water flows out to the bay and to the ocean. So septic tanks, as a result of rising sea level waters, are now being compromised. The reason being, and I'm putting up a great graphic that shows what it looks like, the septic tank system is meant to have the main tank, and it has what is known as a drain field. The drain field is meant to operate in such a way that the wastewater from the septic tank kind of flows through and ultimately ends up at the bottom layer of soil. Now, as sea level waters rise, that bottom layer of soil is not rendered as usable. In other words, it's not able to effectively filter out, because the whole point of the septic tank system is for that last layer of soil to absorb the water, absorb whatever may be in that water as far as sewage that could have gotten through, and it kind of recycles it all in a sense, right? For lack of a better phrase, because I am not a septic tank engineer, but the point is that last layer of soil is meant to be like the last line of defense. The problem is, as sea level waters rise, that last layer of soil may not be able to work as intended. Now, diving into the actual ordinance, we will see, and I'll put this up right now, what the ordinance actually states. Now, the ordinance states that prior to entering into contract, the actual disclosure language that must be on the addendum to the contract or must be included in the contract has to state, land involved in this transaction has a septic tank system installed on it or is serviced by a septic tank system. Septic tank systems may be subject to local, state, and federal regulations. Improperly maintained septic tank systems may pose substantial risks to human health and the environment. It is recommended that the purchaser of this land consider obtaining an inspection of the septic tank system by a qualified professional. Now, once the seller and buyer have included the necessary disclosure language in the contract or added as an addendum, although really the obligation falls on the seller because they are the party that is required to disclose it. At closing, the warranty deed or whatever other deed document is drafted by the closing agent in order to transfer title from the seller to the buyer must contain the following language, and that language must be acknowledged by the buyer. And that language reads as follows. I hereby certify that I have read, understood, and signed the septic tank system disclosure statement for the conveyance of this real property, as required by Section 21-49.1 of the Code of Miami-Dade County, Florida. As you can see there, once again, when the buyer is closing, in order for the warranty deed to be recorded, it must contain this language. Otherwise, the seller could be subject to penalties pursuant to this ordinance. Now, what are those penalties if the seller does not disclose prior to contract and they do not have this language? According to the section, it's approximately $1,000. Now, the interesting thing to see is I want to see how this plays out over time, because as an attorney, I can tell you a lot of times what ends up happening is laws, ordinances, etc. are passed. Now, it is only over time that as they are implemented, as they are enacted, as they are challenged, that we will know in practice how it will apply. For right now, what we are recommending to sellers of properties is get the language that's in the ordinance. It's in an addendum. We have prepared it already for our agents, sellers, etc., and incorporate that. And at closing, we incorporate the necessary language as well, and it is added onto the deed, and we require that the buyer sign it. So now that you understand a little bit about the history and how this ordinance was enacted and what it actually requires, I just wanted to give you all a couple of my thoughts as to how I see this playing out. First and foremost, I think that if you're a buyer and you're buying a property, you're definitely going to want to get a septic tank inspection. You're going to want to do some additional research as to the age of the tank, how soon you may need to replace it, etc. Because especially if you're in a more of a low-lying area, there's some possibility, although this is all speculation at this point, that sooner rather than later Miami-Dade County may come and do require inspections of tanks. And now that this ordinance is out there, they can come and say, well, you were aware that it had a septic tank system, you should have had it inspected. And maybe there's something coming down the pipe where Miami-Dade County is going to try to redo their zoning rules and requirements, etc., to try to require that individuals update their septic tank systems. Then the next thought that I have on this is that I really want to see how this starts to play out in practice, and if maybe some sort of change or is made to the ordinance. Because, for example, I really don't understand why Miami-Dade County felt the need to add the requirement that it be signed on the conveyance document. The reality is, if you're a buyer and you're buying a property, right? Okay, the seller has to disclose prior to entering into the contract. That makes perfect sense to me, right? Okay, fine. Before going under the contract, we want to make it absolutely clear to a buyer that, listen, this property is serviced by a septic tank, and you may want to get it inspected, right? The issue I have is with the requirement for the buyer to sign on the date of closing. I just don't understand it, because maybe I need a little more clarity as to what the commission was thinking, or whatever the legal minds behind this were thinking. Because at the end of the day, on the date of closing, the buyer has no real contingencies left to get out of the contract. Now, assuming the only thing could be that if on the date of closing, right, if the buyer wasn't given the proper disclosure, does the buyer now have the right to cancel the contract, pursuant to this new ordinance? I don't know in theory whether that's going to hold up, because that boils on a lot of legal issues, and I just don't want to go down that wormhole, right? And I'm going to have to do some more research as to whether that's going to be allowed. But the most important thing is I'm just looking at it from a logistical perspective. On the date of closing, right, typically the way it works nowadays is the seller will meet with, their attorney. They'll prepare the documents and send it to the buyer's closing agent, right? Now, what ends up happening is the buyer and the seller are both signing typically at the same time. So usually the buyer has left the closing agent's office when the seller's documents are arriving. So it's just going to be another logistical thing that, sellers are going to have to sign early enough that the documents can be delivered to the buyer's closing agent in time, so the buyer's closing agent has the deed on hand, or people are going to have to add it onto another page and just basically make it now like an addendum to the deed. So there's all these little logistical issues. Right now what we've done is we've put it all on the same page, because we don't know how the recorder is going to approach it. So, it's going to be interesting to see as this progresses how it works. The next part is this fine that Miami-Dade County is levying, right? Pursuant to what they've put in the ordinance, it's going to be $1,000. How exactly are they going to assess the fine? Is it going to be a violation against the property? On subsequent versions, are they, really they have no recourse for a lien, right? Because let's assume a seller didn't disclose, buyer closed. I mean, the fine is against the property owner's name, but I'm just curious to see how that $1,000 mechanism works out, right? And the last part is, just I think, especially buyers of properties that are considering to do substantial remodeling or maybe even a new construction on the property once they purchase something, are going to be a lot more skittish because, if you're buying that property, you're going to want to do a lot of research and, speak to your contractor and understand, how far your property is from, for example, the sewer system, because it may affect, you may be thinking that you're going to do a new build and that property can be done with a septic tank system, which, can be anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000. But if you're going to be required to connect to sewer and that's further away, you may be looking at a $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 expense that could throw off all the numbers of your construction budget. So, you're going to want to do a lot more research, especially if you're one of these buyers. So that being said, I'm going to keep, monitoring this issue. I'm going to keep providing updates. If you have any questions, comments, etc., you want to discuss this further, feel free to send me a message or write a comment below. Once again, this is Jonathan Alfonso, and thank you for joining our YouTube channel.